this on? Hi, good morning, everyone. This is great. I can tell the Midwesterners in the room. Good morning. Welcome to the first NYU Charter Cities Institute New Cities Conference. I am very grateful to everyone who's here today. Thank you for coming. This conference is being jointly hosted by the Charter Cities Institute, which Curtis will talk about in a few moments, and the NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management. So I am a former employee of the NYU Marin Institute, currently an affiliated scholar, and unfortunately our director, Angela Hawken, isn't able to be here today, so it's my pleasure and burden to say a few words about the Marin Institute and kick the conference off in that way. So the NYU Marin Institute is, in large part, I'd say, a brainchild of Dr. Paul Romer, who we have here with us today. It evolved from the NYU Stern Urbanization Project, which was an attempt to tackle probably the biggest single economic and demographic transition taking place on the planet in this century, which is the movement of people to cities. It's a phenomenon that's been going on for a couple of hundred years, but that really has reached its peak in the last few decades, and that in the next few decades will start to taper and slow. So for those of us who are working in this space, who are interested in urban growth, urbanization, and see this as the area where we want to make our impact on the world, this is really the best and most exciting time to be doing it, but it's also the time where we face the most challenges. So the NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management seeks to address this problem by improving the way that cities are run, the way that cities are built, and by bringing together practitioners and scholars to do relevant research that can not only impact policy, but also have a direct impact on the ground. It sometimes is called a think-do tank. The work on new cities was very much at the core of the NYU Stern Urbanization Project and is really in the DNA of the Marin Institute. And especially if we consider new cities as an umbrella that includes the general need for more space for people to live in urban areas is still very much at the core of what the Marin Institute does through the work of Professor Solly Angel and his excellent efforts on urban growth, especially in low-income cities, rapidly growing cities, and secondary cities. So it's very exciting for us to bring this topic to the Marin Institute with a wonderful partner like the Charter Cities Institute. And I think what NYU Marin is hoping will happen today is that we'll have an exchange of views between scholars and practitioners, people who have worked on the ground, and people who are working in theory. The new city space is very, very broad. As an academic discipline, it's largely unformed. A lot of core data hasn't even been gathered yet. So this is a young field, it's a new field, and our hope is that this conference and conferences like it will help it start to gel and become something that really can improve the quality of life and the economic prospects for the many people who are undergoing this incredible transition from being rural, living close to the land, being urban, living close to each other. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Curtis Lockhart, the Executive Director of the Charter Cities Institute, and I hope everyone enjoys the day. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I know it's a rainy Saturday afternoon, and this is an all-day thing, so I don't take that lightly. Thanks for taking the time. The Charter Cities Institute, we are a think tank. We sometimes use the term think-do tank, but try and stay away from it. Based out of Washington, D.C., and we just opened CCI Zambia, which is now leading our Africa work out of Lusaka. Our vision is to empower new cities with better governance to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty, and we want to do that through new charter cities. And so our work really encompasses we could categorize it into 3 separate buckets. One is around research, and I'll talk a bit more about that today. One is on events, so events just like this, co-hosting with institutions like NYU's Marin Institute. Last October, we hosted a similar event, which I know Martin was here, and I think there are a few others in the room that were at MIT as well, with MIT's Sustainable Urbanization Lab, and we have a few other partner organizations that we hope to do similar events in the future. And then the third bucket of work that we do is around partnerships, so working with both governments on the public sector side on policy and charter cities legislation and regulations, things like this, as well as with new city projects themselves, things like helping new city developers with master plans, commercial feasibility, and the like. So that's a bit about our work. A few housekeeping items. I'll go over the program for today at a high level. So there are going to be 3 basic blocks. The first block is going to be about charter cities and urban governance. We have both kind of more proponents, and then we have some critics in the room as well. So there'll be, as Patrick said, a sort of open dialogue, which is great. Astrid's smiling in the back of the room. And then there'll be lunch. We'll break for lunch for an hour, reconvene after that for the middle block of the day, which is more about urban planning and urban form in the Global South. We'll have 3 speakers then. After each of those 2 blocks, there'll be a panel discussion with each of the speakers. And then at the end of the day, there will be a third block that's more of a reflections block. So that'll be Ed Glazer, who is going to arrive late. He's coming from another conference. And there'll be an end-of-day panel discussion with himself, Professor Paul Romer, Professor Bill Easterly, and Professor Juan Du, who braved a snowstorm from Toronto to be here. So thank you. So that's a brief outline for the speakers. Just speak into the mic, because then it's picked up for the video recording, which will be posted after the event. And then after the entire conference, please, everyone in the room, stick around for drinks and a happy hour and mingling afterwards. Other than that, should be a great day. I'm going to introduce the first speaker is Professor Paul Romer. Paul is a university professor in economics at NYU Stern School. He's a co-recipient of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work integrating technological innovations into long-run macroeconomic analysis. Paul previously served as chief economist at the World Bank. He was the founding director of the Marin Institute, and he was the one who first introduced the concept of charter cities back in 2009. So without further ado, Professor Paul Romer to kick off the day. Thank you.
I was speaking to a publisher recently who was trying to talk me into writing a book, and he said, you know, I think you're better known for charter cities than you are for this stuff about ideas. So go figure. Who knows? I wanted to start with just a few remarks about cities. Cities are something where once you start thinking about them, it's hard to stop. They're just so compelling, and they're so much in our, right in our face in terms of everyday experience. And they operate on these extremes, like millions, tens of millions, maybe soon hundreds of millions of people, and a mere, sometimes thousands of square kilometers of land. So then the extremes of density as well. To give you one just illustration of how extreme cities are, I remember thinking about the US effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was an attempt to secure about 1 million square kilometers, which didn't succeed. There were about 80 million people living there. If they lived in the density of New York, they could have lived in about 8,000 square kilometers instead of 1 million. And if, if the enormous expenditure the U.S. had put into trying to secure 1 million square kilometers had gone to 8,000 square kilometers, we might have actually accomplished something. The other dimension, though, is that cities make us think about centuries as the time scale. Cities evolve over centuries. They last on that scale. And governance structures emerge and become durable over centuries. A quote that I'll come back to later is one from Gordon Brown that I like, which is that in establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind when we think about, what would it have taken? Maybe it would have taken concentrating on, thousands of square kilometers instead of millions, but maybe centuries instead of a decade. The intricacy of the order and the structures that determine our interactions with cities just kind of boggle the mind when we look at them. And in terms of the kind of the insights of Alain, the fact that we can get this order without design or without much design is really quite astonishing. But the much part is also critical. And Alain and Solly were the two who really helped me appreciate this part of urbanization, just the critical role of some structure, some design early on. I think I should also say that the most important thing I learned from the work here at NYU is that as interesting as new cities are, as thought experiments, maybe as even practical projects that we could undertake, the most important opportunity for better policy is in this realm of urban expansion. We don't know how many new cities there may be, if any, but we know that the extent of urban areas is going to continue to grow. And there's a huge amount at stake in a little bit of protection of kind of a grid of public space before that development takes place. Just a little bit of planning so that the expansion turns into effective urbanization instead of dysfunctional urbanization. But so even if the policy and human stakes are probably bigger on trying to just adjust the course of urban expansion, new cities still capture the mind and I think are good at forcing us to think a little bit outside of the narrow confines we sometimes get stuck in. There's something compelling about, for example, the potential for what looks like an arbitrage opportunity. There's billions of people who want to move to cities, so the demand is there. There's a lot of land that could be turned into cities, and you'd only need a relatively small amount of it to create a city. And then the value of that land, skyrockets when you make it urban land instead of rural land. So there is a kind of it's seemingly at first a kind of an arbitrage opportunity that's very compelling. If you think about it from a public finance perspective, it's a way to finance something like an urbanization project, or really to finance governance more broadly. At the intellectual level, one of the deep driving forces here is increasing returns. There are many kinds of things where if you do more of it, you get proportionally more value. And economics is kind of focused on those, and those are easier to understand. But the things where when you increase the scale, if you double the scale, you get more than twice as much output. So you have an increasing return to scale. Those are intellectually very challenging to think about. There's a built-in instability about increasing returns to scale. If you think about just the location of cities, cities could have grown up almost anywhere. You know, it's sort of like a city is a place where a lot of people pay high rents to be close to other people who are paying high rents. That could happen almost anywhere. Accidents of history and things like, you know, transport, rivers, and so forth do make some difference. Actually, I must say, when I thought about an urban alternative in Afghanistan, Afghanistan looked to me like one of the few places where it might not be even feasible to have a successful city, that the geography and its neighbors are so difficult that, you know, it might not have been feasible to have a successful city in Afghanistan. City, like, you know, like New York City. But there are a lot of other places around the world. If you just restrict yourself to coastal locations, a lot of other places where cities could have grown up, they might still grow up. But that instability, why here instead of there? Could it have been here instead of there? In the development of the U.S. West, you know, was Chicago or St. Louis going to be the gateway city that suddenly took off in a boom? That kind of instability is intrinsic to increasing returns. There's also an interesting kind of tension between things that are determined by history, like accidents of history, as opposed to things that are determined purely by expectations. Chicago and St. Louis both had some historical developments based on accidents and their transport opportunities. But there was a big open question about, was everybody expecting Chicago to be the gateway, or was everybody expecting St. Louis to be the gateway? And everybody wanted to go invest in the place where everybody else thought it was going to emerge. So expectational indeterminacy becomes an interesting part of this as well. The kind of framework economists use to think about how people divide up their efforts and how the benefits of all the value they create get distributed is a competitive equilibrium. And competitive equilibrium doesn't exist when you have increasing returns. You end up with something that looks like a competitive equilibrium, but you know there have to be a bunch of monopolies in the background which are somehow deciding how all of the benefits created by increasing returns get divided up. In the terminology of game theory, when you have increasing returns, there's no core, there's no stable allocation that can't be improved on. So there's always this kind of tension that things could fly apart, or there could always be contentious fights about how to divide up the gains when you have increasing returns to scale. Cities, I think, also make us think a little differently about things like governance. There is this issue of what are the foundations of the rule of law. And by the way, you know, this one is in play right now in Israel. Israel looks like one of the exceptions to Brown's rule because it's not really very old, but it seemed like they had just almost like out of the box started out with a kind of rule of law where a judicial system put some constraints on what the democratically chosen legislative and executive branches could do. And there's a great concern right now that even though it seemed like it was working, it may turn out to actually be very unstable, and changes by the current government might actually destroy the rule of law in Israel. So it's starting to look less like an exception and more like a proof of the kind of intrinsic instability of the rule of law itself. Cities also make us think a lot about, I think, or think at least differently about things like checks and balances. We tend to see the benefits of the checks when we think about the national government, but we tend to see the advantages of executive authority when we see that balances the value of the checks when you think about national government, but you see the value of like strong executive powers when you think about cities. I used to enjoy asking people, especially when he was still active, well, how do you feel about Lee Kuan Yew as an authoritarian ruler? And oh no, that's really bad, you know. How do you feel about Lee Kuan Yew as a strong mayor? Oh, that's good. Yeah, we need strong mayors. And it's like, well, you know. But executive authority still matters in cities, and some of the most important functions of governance, protecting public health and limiting crime, get resolved at the level of the city, and it's the executive that either makes sure that happens or doesn't. And as we've seen, it's not as though, even over long periods of time, it's not as though the understanding that some ability of the public or the executive to limit what individuals can do, it's not as though there's a consensus that, oh, that's an important thing, that you can, to prevent the spread of disease, that the officials can put some limits on what people can do. It's been astonishing how little, support and how fragile the support for those kind of public health measures turned out to be in the most recent pandemic. Now, there are other sides of cities that I think make this endeavor a little bit, problematic. New cities in particular appeal to, I think, the wannabe dictator in many people. If you just look in the last week or so, Donald Trump had for like a minute, he was focused on the idea of freedom cities, and then he moved on. But, for a minute, freedom cities were going to be his big new thing. Elon Musk is in the newspaper in the last couple of days about a city that he's kind of supposedly developing in Texas. That's a city of about 6,000 acres, so not at all the kind of scale that I think gets interesting. But still, it's in discussion. And there's also this kind of libertarian appeal about somehow we can think of cities as corporate-like structures, and there's just no need for governance. I think that appeal is just profoundly wrong, but it persists. My strategy in dealing with it is just every time I get into one of those conversations, I just ask, who hires and fires the police chief? And that pretty much shuts down the libertarian thing. The typical answer is, oh, we're not going to have police, but you don't even have to push back on that. That's the kind of statement that undermines itself. There's also, I think, a tension between the notion of what I think we should call a reform zone, of which there have been a few that were important, like Mauritius that set up a conceptual zone. It wasn't even a geographic zone, but a conceptual zone for a free trade, for an expansion of free trade. And it was a reform zone in, I think, the sense that we should intend a reform zone, which was that it pioneered rules which then spread throughout the whole nation. And that's what a reform zone should do. But the reality is that most zones are what I would call concession zones, where you get an exception from the prevailing rules in the rest of the country, but where this exception is something that you don't want to have scale to the whole country, because you can't afford it. Like, you're going to exempt people from, you have like a tax holiday where you don't have to pay taxes. And concession zones, I think, have deservedly a terrible reputation. They don't move you towards broad reform in the nation. I think they actually build up a constituency for maintaining a lot of the dysfunctional regulations, because that makes the concession even more valuable. So a lot of stuff that passes that tries to pass itself off as a new city or a reform zone is really just a concession zone, and we have to, I think, always be attentive to distinguish ourselves from that and to be clear about what it is we really think could be beneficial. Well, with those kind of framing remarks, let me just talk about the thing that, one of the things that's interested me in the last few years, which is I think the looming challenge of migration. Solly really captured my imagination, and I think everybody's imagination, with this notion of the urbanization project as this very big thing that humans are in the middle of doing, and that we're now doing in such an intense way right now. But there's another kind of project that I think has been operating in parallel, which is really the one highlighted by Gordon Brown. In the 1600s, around the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, there was this notion that emerged of the nation state. And we take that as something that's so obvious, it's hard to imagine a time when that didn't exist or wasn't a concept, but it wasn't a concept before Westphalia. And I think the idea of a nation state was actually extremely foreign to people when it was first proposed. The notion that there could be some area that they would make their own decisions and that other people couldn't somehow go in and meddle, that, like the Holy Roman Emperor or the Pope couldn't kind of just come in and muck around, and that somehow, there should be this very diffuse system where anybody could kind of jump in and try and influence decisions about religious practice in a country or any other policy issue. That just seemed, I think, natural to everyone. And Westphalia created this notion of there are clear borders, and that you don't mess around in somebody else's country. Like, one country can do things internally, but you don't try and you have to respect the borders. I think this is a principle that has been, I think, ultimately very important in stopping national conflict. It's the principle that's in play right now in Ukraine. But the West also has been guilty, I think, of playing fast and loose with it, because in creating Kosovo and South Sudan, the West, basically the US and Britain, just violated the principles of Westphalia, which included the idea that you don't get to redraw borders. And once you open up that can of worms of saying, well, maybe sometimes we get to, if our intentions are good, the can of worms there has turned out to be, I think, very, very problematic. So Westphalia is something that I think we really have to try and, this notion of Westphalian sovereignty, something we have to try and respect. But and by the way, it's in real tension with this notion of the charter cities that I've talked about. Like, could we create another Hong Kong? I think there's a way to reconcile that if you think of it as a lease and, of limited duration rather than a permanent change in a border. But it's a little bit of a fine distinction. But in any case, Westphalia has created a problem for us because it not only defined the limits on land, but it also defined the limits on migration for people. So a nation was a border and then a group of people inside. Then if you think about Gordon Brown's story, if it takes centuries to establish the rule of law, if you start a race where all these different nations, and by the way, the Treaty of Westphalia started in Europe, but it's now spread really throughout the whole world. This idea of the importance of sovereignty and borders has really taken over the whole world. But you start a race where everybody tries to see, can we achieve this very difficult kind of equilibrium of a kind of a government which is responsive to people, but yet including often, usually responsive to the democratic majorities, but yet is still constrained by the rule of law. If it takes that long to build up that kind of equilibrium, you know that the race to get through this transition is going to be one where some countries are going to get it done earlier, others are going to be lagging behind. And that's the world that we live in right now. If you start with the Magna Carta in Britain, and you run forward, they got to a form of rule of law, but there are many countries that are, still back at the Magna Carta or even before. And that creates a growing tension because there are huge benefits that come from the rule of law and governance that can achieve certain things, but is still limited in its in the extent to which it can intervene. So we now live in a situation where there are billions of people who, one, don't have access to the cities that they want to move to, but two, don't have access to an economic system that operates under the conditions of the rule of law that can offer the benefits that they want. Now, just a side note, the notion of a charter city, I think, bundled together all kinds of different possibilities, but the one piece that I think is worth unbundling from that is the notion of trade in government services. We're used to international trade and private services, but we really haven't thought very much about trade in government services. And there is this kind of, these examples, like Mauritius, because it was part of the Commonwealth, still had the Privy Council, the Supreme Court in the UK, acting as the court of final appeal for the judicial system in Mauritius. So it was a kind of an export of judicial services from Britain to Mauritius. Nobody's ever really figured out how to pay for those services. The Privy Council did this essentially for free. But it turned out to be very valuable, and Mauritius succeeded not just in becoming a textile hub initially because it adopted free trade, but it became a financial center because it could operate under a system of judicial independence that was made possible by this agreement about having an external court of final appeal. So I think we haven't thought enough about unpacking particular government services and extending them, if they can function in one place, extending them to another place as a way to use a kind of a process of diffusion of the benefits of rule of law instead of insisting that it has to emerge organically in every place. But there may be limits on how far you can go with that. Think about my question, who hires and fires the police chief? There may be some limit on the degree to which people are going to accept a kind of external system. Although, again, if you go back to Hong Kong, people were pretty happy with Hong Kong under British rule. So maybe we're selling this idea short. But for whatever reason, we have not seen, and I don't see a lot of prospect for a lot more diffusion of government services from places where the rule of law exists. So what we're left with is a situation where billions of people want to move. The Gallup says, and maybe they're being a little bit alarmist, but they say there's 700 million people around the world right now who say they move to another country if they could. I think if it were really clear what that would mean, like could they be accepted permanently as residents? Could they be incorporated into the society? I think the number is larger, potentially larger than even 700 million. So then you have to think hard about how are we going to deal with this potential flow of migrants. And it's worth keeping in mind that Russia in particular, and some of its client states, have been using what they think of as the weaponization of refugee flows as a way to undermine some of the countries, the democratically governed countries that they see as their enemies. The migration is a very destabilizing process. European political systems, I think, are now at greater risk because of the threat of and some reality of migration flows. I think European political systems may be under greater threat from that than they were from either fascism or communism. The reasons for this, I think, can be understood partly because of through the lens of a paper that Ed Glaser wrote with Andre Schleifer where they referred to the Curley effect, where they're thinking about a democratic system, but I think it applies to all governments, when your system of government is making very important decisions about who can migrate in and who can't, you get some really potentially very perverse incentives that are created. Let me illustrate it with, you can read and Andre's story about Boston and kind of catering to a particular clientele there. I want to tell a slightly different story. Think of Sunnis and Shiites who lived in integrated neighborhoods and relative harmony under Saddam Hussein, who was a brutal dictator and should be criticized on many grounds, but who at least maintained some conditions of security. Then when those conditions of security were destroyed, all of a sudden there was this polarization into ethnically cleansed neighborhoods and local militias and so forth. So imagine that somebody had created a new city and said, look, you can move if you're kind of afraid of what's happening in Iraq, you can move to this new city. And suppose you as a bunch of, say, Shiites move there, and then you start to see Sunnis moving in. And you think, well, God, if the Sunnis come in, if they become dominant, they'll create they'll take over the police force and they'll oppress all of us Shiites. So, we got to take over the police force first, and we got to stop them from coming in. Any of these, external threats or kind of pre-existing tensions, threats of violence, could immediately play out in fights about who gets allowed to migrate in, unless this new location is a place where everybody is as confident as they were under Saddam Hussein that somebody else is going to keep things safe. And then you don't have to worry so much about the makeup of the population coming in. I think this creates what I've referred to in something I wrote as a trilemma. There are three things that we might need in the world right now. One is large-scale immigration into a new location. So migration flows that could be bigger than or substantially bigger than the existing population. Large-scale immigration, equal treatment under the law, and then local democratic accountability. And my claim is you just can't have all three of those things. You only get two out of the three. You can just shut down migration, which is what most democratic systems do. You can violate equal treatment. You can say, well, the people who are here are the ones who get to participate in local elections, but anybody who comes in is a second-class citizen who can't have the same rights that we have. This is like the systems in places like Dubai. And there's various ways to enforce this, like you don't let families come, you make sure people leave, so you want to make it this durable commitment that the people who are coming in don't have the same legal status as the people who are there. In the long run, those kinds of systems are going to create very bad conditions if you're ultimately hoping to get to something like a system of democracy. So you can stop migration, you can give up on equal treatment, or you can give up on local democratic accountability, or at least temporarily give up on that. And I think this is the way to think about Hong Kong. Hong Kong had a governor who was accountable to a democracy, but it was a democracy in the UK, not people who lived in Hong Kong. So if you were a resident of Hong Kong and you saw the prospect of like millions of Chinese coming in, if you were Chinese but you liked the Hong Kong system, you might not worry about the prospect of lots of new arrivals because they can't vote to overturn the system that you like. They're in Hong Kong. Like you might like the fact that they had established an equilibrium with low corruption in Hong Kong. Most people coming in from China had not ever experienced that kind of system, and if they had had more democratic authority, they might have converted Hong Kong into that kind of system. But because British voters were ultimately the ones who were in charge, and then the governor could do something like appoint the Independent Commission Against Corruption that reported directly to him or her, then you could establish a different equilibrium that people liked in Hong Kong without official corruption. You might need to maintain this kind of absence of local democratic accountability until the point where you've basically had enough inflow to get to something like your steady state, and like the capacity that this piece of land can hold. And then it seems to me you can make the easy transition to local democratic accountability and still equal treatment under the law. You can have very small scale migration flows at that point, but nothing that could be, say, big enough to overturn the political status quo. So I think there's a way to think about the sequencing of this process of accommodating migration. But I think if we don't come up with something that resolves these tensions, we'll be stuck in an equilibrium where we just try and stop the migration. We just say to families, if you want to try and migrate, you're going to risk having your kids drowned. And we're going to do that to make the cost of migrating high enough so that many of you will, decide not to migrate. So these accidents with the boats, I think, are an intrinsic part of the equilibrium we're in, where we're just trying desperately to force people not to come. I think this threat of bigger migration flows, and all this is exacerbated by better communications, easier transport. I mean, the pressures to move, the repressed demand to move to places that have rule of law, I think the demand grows as people's awareness about the possibilities grows. And I think that this may be one of the factors which seems to be undermining political systems throughout the West. I'll also just, and as I said, that the West talks about these weaponized migration flows where like Russia and other actors have been intentionally manipulating these because they know that this causes instability in the West, and the Western countries feel very vulnerable about this. But I think just the final note I'll close on is that if you think about how this war in Ukraine is going to play out, there's no way to defeat Russia militarily because it has this nuclear arsenal that it can use if it's at risk of being completely defeated, say the way Hitler was in Germany or the Japanese were. So that's not going to happen. But the thing that I think could happen if the world set about doing it is if we made it much easier to leave Russia as Putin tries to scale up the mobilization, as the economic sanctions bite, I think a lot of people would see that they'd be better off if they could move. So I think the long-run weapon that the West needs to mobilize against Russia is to make it very easy to migrate to someplace like a new Hong Kong. And I think you could do this in practice in someplace like, I don't know, Poland, Estonia, take your pick. It could be in NATO, protected by NATO, and it could pay for itself. Remember, go back to these increasing returns and the gains in the value of the land. So I think encouraging migration in a way that will help stabilize rather than destabilize is going to be a very big opportunity and challenge in the coming decades, and it's one of the many different places where I think new cities could be important. That's all I came to say. Curtis, I don't see Curtis. Where are we on time? I'm way over. Oh, okay. I'm done. I won't take any questions, but I'll be around. So, thanks.